Koreka Senkan no Mikasa des, or the Japanese battleship Mikasa, was a unique pre-dreadnought that would go on to lead the last great clash of battleships in the pre-dreadnought era, then dodge and weave its way through the fortunes and misfortunes of war to reach the present as the sole surviving pre-dreadnought battleship. The ship arose from the circumstances Japan found itself facing at the end of the 19th century. Japan was fighting one of its many on-again, off-again wars with China, a state that would persist until the end of World War II. But at this particular time they had adopted the tenets of the French Jeune École, a school of naval thinking that held that commerce raiding and torpedo attacks would allow a smaller navy to defeat a much larger one. As a result, the Japanese fleet consisted primarily of cruisers and some older ironclads, as well as torpedo boats. But when they'd come up against one of the Chinese fleets, which happened to include a couple of actual battleships, despite having much better gunnery and speed, along with their enemies being hampered by inadequate numbers of shells, and what shells they did have largely being useless, with their warheads full of porcelain and cement, the Imperial Japanese Navy had still taken all day to achieve victory, and it was pretty clear that if the Chinese fleet had been even vaguely competent in their shooting, and or had had working ammunition, then the Imperial Japanese Navy would have lost. Thus, using the money extracted from the Chinese as part of the price of peace, the Japanese launched a program of fleet upgrades, looking to make the core of its fleet 6 battleships and 6 armoured cruisers. This presented something of a problem, namely that the Japanese shipyards, despite modernising rapidly, were not currently in the slightest bit capable of building a modern battleship. So, having discarded the French school of thinking, the Japanese turned to not only the more traditional British tactical doctrine, but also to British shipyards to build their new fleet. Mikasa would be the last of the 6 battleships ordered under this program, and represented, like her immediate predecessor Asahi, a variant on the new formidable class of pre-dreadnoughts, which themselves were ironically designed in response to the first 4 Imperial Japanese battleships, which were variants on the Royal Sovereign and Majestic classes. She would be named, as many Japanese battleships would be, for a mountain, unsurprisingly in this case, Mount Mikasa. As such, she incorporated many of the latest and greatest technological achievements, including new, longer-barreled 40-caliber 12-inch guns, with the traditional twin guns forward and twin guns aft. Although they were not technically in turrets, as per the traditional sense at the time, but rather in fully armoured barbettes. This design would eventually take over the name of gun turrets in the 20th century. The secondary battery consisted of 14 quick-firing 6-inch casement-mounted guns and a tertiary anti-torpedo boat armament of 20 12-pounder or 3-inch guns. An additional 16 smaller 47mm guns in 2 variants and 4 submerged torpedo tubes, 2 per side, completed the offensive equipment. Armour consisted of a belt of the new fancy Krupp steel, which was 9 inches thick at the maximum, and the ship was moved through the water by a couple of triple expansion engines that put 15,000 horsepower through a pair of screws for a top speed of just over 18 knots. She would be laid down in January 1899, launched in November 1900, and completed in March 1902. A couple of years later, the Russo-Japanese War would break out, and her initial actions were not especially inspiring. At the Battle of Port Arthur, the Japanese Navy engaged the coastal defences with their main batteries, and the Russian fleet with their secondary batteries only. This, somewhat unsurprisingly, barely scratched the Russian ships, and the Japanese withdrew after suffering more casualties than the Russians. With battleships on both sides dropping like flies to sea mines, Mikasa managed to avoid this fate, and was the lead ship at the Battle of the Yellow Sea, becoming a primary target for the Russian warships. She would take almost 24 hits and had her rear turret knocked out, her own shells doing significantly less damage than expected, as, in Shades of Jutland over a decade later, they mainly exploded on impact. Her next major action would be as flagship at the Battle of Tsushima, where she spent the first part of the battle, along with a couple of other Japanese warships, ganging up on the embattled Russian flagship, firing all weapons up to and including torpedoes, although the latter didn't actually accomplish much. Japanese shells appear to have worked significantly better this time around, and in return Mikasa endured about 4 dozen hits, including quite a number from 12-inch shells, without much complaint. The most damage coming from her own guns, when the right gun in the forward turret suffered 2 premature detonations, the second of which disabling the entire turret for over half an hour. Having survived the trials of war, less than a week after peace was declared, she caught fire and sank after a magazine cooked off. But the Imperial Japanese Navy could not afford to lose such an important asset, and she was refloated and repaired, and brought back into service after only a couple of years. Never once to miss an opportunity, the Japanese took the chance to replace the 12-inch guns with more powerful 45 caliber models, along with newer 6-inch guns for the secondary battery. Due to the Japanese Navy's smaller size compared to some other powers, she remained an active unit throughout World War I and was only downgraded to a coastal defense ship in 1921. Thus, she was still around by the time of the Washington Naval Treaty, and due to be scrapped as a result of it. However, the Japanese requested the right to preserve her as long as she was encased in concrete, thus removing her from active service permanently, and this was agreed. She would then escape major damage in World War II, although in the post-war occupation she would begin to deteriorate until the late 1950s, when she was restored, and she can now be visited in Mikasa Park, Yokosuka, today.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.